Hello, I'm going to be presenting on the article I chose, which is titled Images Influencing Images: How Pictorial Context Affects the Emotional Interpretation of Art Photographs. Here are the listed authors, and I have included a reference page at the end of the presentation as well. So, to introduce the breakdown of this article, the goal represented was to explore how surrounding images influence emotional interpretation of art photos. So, how does context shape perception? There were many theoretical bases that were described in this article. To name a few, um, one is that art exists with a contextual environment. So, art cannot be separated from the context in which it exists. In addition, judgments are shaped by nearby stimuli. So, this describes how perception works in context with nearby stimuli. The research questions posed by the authors include: how does ambiguity of a target image affect context influence? And the authors define ambiguity as when multiple meanings are attributed to an object and the meaning varies depending on the information, context, and interaction between an observer and an object. And another research question posed was: does juxtaposed imagery shift perceived emotion of art? So, how does context and juxtaposition affect how an art image is perceived and the emotions related to that? The hypotheses presented by the authors include that art images are contextually influenced, formal similarity strengthens this influence. In addition, negative emotional context produces stronger effects than positive. So they are aiming to dive further into questions about how art is perceived, what context means, and how it affects emotional perception. And they hypothesize that similarity strengthens this influence, as well as negative emotional context strengthens the effect of perception. So the article breaks down into two studies. Study one, these are the methods, the methods, the design, and the procedure of study one. So study one involved 106 participants recruited from Prolific with a mean age of 26.3. The design of the study includes the participants are to view 20 fine art images alone and then with context images. They are to rate for ambiguity, valence, and emotional effect. And valence in a psychological context refers to how pleasant or unpleasant a stimuli is. And then the study was broken down into three blocks. Block one described the ambiguity and valence of the context images. Block two was an extraction of demographic information, including age and gender. And block three was the emotional evaluation with the context images. In study two, it consisted of a total of 178 participants, 122 of which were recruited from Prolific, and 56 of which were recruited from FHNW Academy of Art and Design in Switzerland. So, four experimental pairing conditions were defined in study two. In the negative formal similarity condition, a fine art photograph, which is the target image, was shown with a negatively valenced oasis image, the context image, that was formally similar. In the negative no formal similarity condition, a fine art photograph was shown with a negatively valenced context image that was not formally similar. In the positive formal similarity condition, an art photograph was presented with a positively valenced context image that was formally similar. In the positive no formal similarity condition, one art photograph was presented with a positively valenced context image that was not formally similar. And the same stimuli were used in study 2 as in study 1. That involves the target and context images, so the fine art photographs as well as the OASIS derived photographs that are described as non-art photographs. The design and procedure of the second study involve each target image shown under each of the 4 conditions I just mentioned, and it was also broken down into 3 blocks. Block 1, participants were asked to view and rate each pair. In Block 2, similarly to Study 1, the demographics were extracted, as well as the participants' affect, so how they were feeling. In Block 3, the participants were to rate valence of target images with context images. The key findings of these studies involved that when ambiguity was presented first, there are stronger shifts in emotional ratings. In addition, the effect of juxtaposition involves when ambiguity is first listed, there is a contrast between positive and negative effect. And when valence is first introduced, there's an assimilation of a negative effect and a contrast of a positive effect. Negative context had greater emotional impact, and that was something that was hypothesized by the authors. So to discuss the findings, the ambiguity moderates context effects. So how an object and the meaning depends on the information and interaction between an observer and an object, moderates how the context affects emotion. Also the order of evaluation matters, and that affects the outcome. So whether or not, in the previous slide, if ambiguity was first displayed or if valence was first displayed. And these studies also provide empirical support for existing theories. So the previous theories that art cannot be separated from its context, as well as perception is based on nearby stimuli. This information is valuable for curators, photographers, artists, design professionals, as well as anybody who is involved in perceiving art and wants to understand how that process works. In terms of ethical considerations for this article, I didn't find any issues ethically. Informed consent and anonymity were ensured. There was a small symbolic compensation of about $2 converted. I don't think participants were expecting money. I think they wanted to be a part of this experiment, and the $2 was sort of a thank you from the authors. The limitations of these studies involve that one couldn't isolate which mental framework was activated by context effects. So, what was previously known by the participant, the experimenters had no way of knowing exactly what information was involved in activating context. For future researchers of this sort of experiment, they should use more abstract or ambiguous images. This involves complications as abstraction is objectively more subjective, um, but I think that there's more to dive into in terms of how abstraction is perceived. In addition, researchers should explore different media types and cultural contexts. So the images used were Western fine art images, and um, that sort of confines this study to how Western art is perceived, um, and doesn't explore other cultural forms of art. In conclusion, context deeply affects art interpretation. So, what was hypothesized and what was found is that context does affect emotion and perception. In addition, participants' ratings shifted based on image order, pairing, and viewer background. So, it did matter what sort of expertise the participant had, in what order the images were paired, and which images were paired with which. This study bridges theory and perception with real world applications in art and design. So, curators can use this study to um, specifically identify which images will produce the wanted emotional perception. Here are the references of my paper and of this presentation. Thank you so much for your time and have a wonderful day.